The road locked solid in a heartbeat. From the dark, something narrowed its gaze on you. Doors strain against their frames as the wind howls outside. Tonight, 9 all-new Ontario horror stories push against the edges of what you fear most. Like the video, share your theories in the comments, and subscribe for the next drop. The snow doesn't just erase footprints. It hides what was never meant to be found. In every story, a forbidden room waits in silence, daring someone to open it. Hit like, tell us what you think is behind that door, and subscribe to uncover the next truth. That quiet highway isn't empty. It's listening. 9 fresh Ontario chills are waiting for you. Comment the moment that unsettled you the most, and subscribe for more vaults of frozen dread. Ice creeps across the windows. Whispers move through the walls. 9 new Ontario horrors await. Dive in, tell us which twist caught you off guard, and subscribe before the next story begins. Subscribe now to Something Scary, where the cold stories don't end and the next fear is already waiting. And before you go, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? When the first snow came, I didn't notice it at first. The town's usual quiet was muffled, a soft, patient hush that felt like a held breath. Then the road iced over, not a slushy glaze you shake off with a towel, but a deliberate glassy skin that clung to everything with the stubborn precision of a collector. I learned to drive as if the world were a fragile chandelier. Careful turns, deliberate gas, eyes half on the road and half on the shadows at the edge of the headlights. People who'd lived here their whole lives said the cold didn't bite as hard if you kept moving, if you kept your routine, if you treated the night as a guest you didn't want to insult. But routines have a way of turning on you when the world forgets to wake up. I'd taken a shift at the municipal depot that night. A job I never intended to keep but somehow kept finding reasons to stay with. The depot sits on the edge of town, where the streetlights thin out and the wind becomes a voice you can almost hear, the old kind that sounds like it's whispering your secrets back to you. The job's a simple one. Monitor the thermostats in the old waterworks, keep an eye on the circuits in the shelter, and pretend the hum of the city isn't a confession every time the generator coughs. It's not glamorous, but it's predictable, which is a kind of comfort when the world outside starts to behave as if it's auditioning for a nightmare. I remember the moment the snow started to fall in earnest, the way the flakes opened up like tiny knives and then folded themselves into the air, as if the night itself had decided to knit a shawl out of cold. The town looked asleep, and the highway beyond the depot stretched straight and empty, a ribbon of white that seemed to vanish into nothing. I didn't panic. I never panic. Fear, I've learned, is less a scream and more a hiss that travels under your skin, a whisper that sounds like your own voice turning traitor. So I kept my head down, checked the readings, and listened to the building's heart. The distant drip of melted snow inside the pipes, the faint crackle of the old wiring, a rhythm that matched the tremor in my own hands. As the night settled, something shifted. It wasn't a shout or a knock. It was a slow, deliberate alteration in the world's texture. The depot's back door, which usually squeaked like an old hinge, greeted me with a gentler, almost respectful sigh. The corridor lights cast long shadows that moved with a life of their own, stitched together by the glimmer of frost that clung to every surface, as if the cold itself had learned to paint. In the shelter room, where the local records sat in cabinets that smelled faintly of iron and dust, I found a strange calm, an absence of the ordinary noises you expect when people are awake and anxious. No radios, no footsteps, no breathing except my own, which sounded too loud in the quiet. That calm didn't last. The shelter's door, usually a stubborn thing, wouldn't stay shut. It swung with a careful, almost respectful breeze that didn't belong to a wind, but to something being invited inside. When I closed it, the air grew thicker, like a fog you could hear, a gelatinous pressure pressing at my ears. I told myself it was the building adjusting to the cold. Buildings do that, you know. Shrink their noises, husk their voices, pretend nothing is happening even as the world tilts a degree toward menace. Then I heard it. The first sign, not of nature, but of a presence, clear as a whisper against glass. A soft, deliberate tapping, a rhythm that matched the irregular heartbeat under my rib cage. Tap, 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 as if someone was counting time in a language I almost understood. The tunnel through to the old boiler room felt different that night, as if the air itself wore an extra layer of shadow. The heater's old fan wheezed like a creature waking from a long sleep, and somewhere beyond the pipes, water dripped with a tempo that suggested purpose, as if each drop belonged to a story I wasn't ready to hear. I checked the gauges again, more out of instinct than need, and found numbers that didn't surprise so much as confirm a suspicion I hadn't admitted to myself yet. The town's cold wasn't merely weather, but a memory, a ledger of every secret tucked away in the dark corners of its streets. There were rooms here I'd never been told existed, doors that hadn't been painted shut, but sealed with a willingness to forget. The most unsettling thing wasn't what I found, but what I didn't find. A gap, a missing line in the chain of routine. The night's screen of white kept growing, swallowing the world in its quiet, and with it came a sense of something watching from the perimeter of sight, a presence that didn't need to be seen to be felt. It's curious how fear can feel like a guest who has decided to stay forever, long after the invitation has been withdrawn. The feeling wasn't a scream, but a cut in the air, a thread pulled slowly from the fabric of sleep. I moved with the carefulness of someone who's learned to walk through a room full of glass, each step a negotiation, each breath a protocol. Then came the rooms. The town has basements and side corridors that locals tell stories about late at night, stories that begin with a joke and end with someone never quite returning the same. I found myself standing before a door I swear wasn't on the plan, its paint a shade too pale, its outline a shade too definite, as if a hand had drawn it with the memory of a fear in mind. I opened it, not because I hoped to uncover something, but because a force stronger than curiosity pushed me forward. The same force that makes you lean toward an edge you're sure contains nothing but air and the possibility of falling. Inside wasn't a room so much as a pause between breaths, a space that felt suspended between what's remembered and what's forgotten. The air tasted of old rain and metal, of winters survived and winters endured. But there was something else there, a current of cold that didn't belong to weather, a memory preserved in ice. In that frozen interior, I found traces, not of people, not of voices, but of a record kept by the last patient mark of time. There were objects arranged with a purpose I couldn't immediately decipher. A chair that faced the door, as if waiting for someone to arrive. A lamp that burned with a pale blue flame. Books stacked in a pyramid, with damp pages that refused to dry. The most striking detail wasn't tangible at first glance. It was a pattern of frost etched into the glass on the wall, a lattice that resembled a map. Or perhaps a map of what wasn't supposed to be found. I approached, breath fogging in a little cloud that told me I wasn't alone, and I saw the lines shift as if an invisible hand were tracing them, revealing a route, an escape, or perhaps a trap, leading to another room beyond the ice-gilded door. I stepped into the second chamber and found the air even colder, almost clinical, the kind of cold that seems to scrub warmth from your thoughts. The floorboards here bore the marks of a long time's wait, as if many people had stood in this same exact spot, waiting for something that never came, or waiting for something that did come and left without a trace. The room felt carefully arranged to evoke memory, the way the furniture's arrangement mirrored coordinates on a map, and the way the light, pale as bone, fell on each surface with the precision of a curator. It was as if someone had cataloged fear here, line by line, and then let the fear sit and harden into a fixture of the space. What happened next wasn't a single moment, but a cascade of small, nearly imperceptible realizations. I realized the room's design wasn't about containment, but about invitation. The invitation to stay, to listen, to become part of the space's history. The first whisper I heard wasn't a voice so much as a memory, a recollection that didn't belong to time but to the place's own life, spoken in a dialect I almost understood and yet couldn't fully translate. It spoke of a night when the road had refused to let people pass, when the town chose to seal itself behind frost and silence to protect something it believed would be harmed by the sun. The whisper promised that if I stayed long enough, I would know what it felt like to be both guest and prisoner, observer and specimen, witness and participant in a larger, colder narrative. I tried to resist. I told myself I was simply exploring, gathering data for a story I could tell later, a cautionary tale about how a community can freeze itself into a legend and forget the warmth of human fear, the warmth of a shared memory that keeps a town human. But inside that room, the walls themselves began to speak in a language of scraping ice and sighing hinges, and the language felt personal, intimate, almost like a confidant warning that curiosity can be misread as consent, the sense of dimensions tightening, of time folding in on itself, grew heavier with each breath. I felt the center of the room shift as if the space were listening to me and deciding what to reveal next. And I realized I wasn't merely an observer, but a participant, a thread being pulled into a larger, colder tapestry. When I finally found my way back to the corridor and then to the depot's main hall, the world outside had changed in a way I couldn't articulate without sounding dramatic. The snow's white noise had grown louder, more aware, almost like a chorus of frozen witnesses, each snowflake a tiny spectator to what I'd just experienced. The generator's hum sounded paler, thinner, as if fear itself had learned to whisper through the vents. And still, I walked. My steps no longer routine, but weighted with the memory of that second room, as if the space's frost had etched itself onto my shoes and into my lungs. Back at my post, I tried to remind myself that it was a single night, that the town would wake up with the sun and everything would return to its ordinary, comforting unease. But the records in the shelter, the lone file cabinet with a single page sticking out, the handwriting I didn't recognize yet couldn't forget, told a different story. The page wasn't a confession or a tally of losses. It was a map, a plan, a promise that the cold would return, the doors would reclose, and the rooms would reopen under new conditions. It wasn't a threat so much as a forecast, a reminder that the frost doesn't merely cover surfaces. It preserves what humanity tries to forget, including the fear of being left inside a room that remembers everything about you, including your name that you've not yet learned to forget. Hours later, as the town began to wake with a stubborn pale light, I left the depot, the weight of that night pressing down with a quiet insistence. The roads looked different now, as if they'd learned to anticipate what the frost would demand next. The air carried a chill that sounded like an audience waiting for a story's closing line, the final line that would make them believe the tale was more than a rumor. And in that moment, I understood something essential about fear. It isn't the scream. It's the way the world tightens around a single, undeniable moment until you can't tell where your memory ends and the memory of the place begins. If I'm telling you this, it's because I want you to listen as a fellow traveler would listen. Eyes open, heart steady but careful, because the next road you take could ask you to see what you've always refused to admit you could see. If you're still listening, you're already part of the story. The frost doesn't forget. It remembers to remind us who we were when the night was deepest. And when the ice begins to thaw in your mind, remember the rooms that taught you to listen, not with your ears alone, but with your entire body. The tremor in your hands, the cadence of a whisper that feels like it's written just for you, and the moment when a door you hadn't planned to open becomes the door you cannot close again. That is how a town survives the cold, by letting its stories breathe in the spaces between its walls, and by inviting strangers to listen until the fear becomes and remains a living memory. If you found yourself drawn into that journey, tell me which moment pulled hardest at your attention, what you imagine happens behind the doors that never fully close, and which detail you'd want to see explored further in the next tale. And if this world has left you curious for more, subscribe and stay with us for the next descent into Ontario's frostbound rooms, where every step you take on the road might echo back at you from a door you never knew existed. I'm going to talk to you like you're sitting with me in that booth, because that's exactly how it felt. There's a point where the dark outside the glass stops being outside and starts pressing against the edges of your thoughts. And if you ever sat through an overnight shift, you already know the feeling I'm talking about. That low hum behind your ears, like your nerves are tuning themselves to some frequency you never agreed to hear. The job was simple. Sit in a little glass box just off the highway, collect tolls when the occasional car rolled through, log each plate in a system that froze more than it worked, and stay awake. That's it. Stay awake. Sounds easy until 3 in the morning when the snow starts drifting sideways across the beams of the streetlights, and the highway goes completely silent. Not quiet, silent. Like the world remembered there was a mute button and decided to press it. The booth itself was nothing special. 4 glass panes, a narrow counter, a heater that rattled every time it kicked in, and a radio that picked up more static than music. On a good night, I'd get enough traffic to remind me there were still other human beings awake somewhere. Headlights slicing the dark, a flash of faces, the brief exchange of money, the faint smell of coffee or smoke. On bad nights, it was just me, the hum of the lights, and the sound of tires in my memory. That night, I remember how the cold felt wrong. Not just, it's winter in Ontario cold, but a kind of sharp, clean cold that seemed to come from under the road instead of the sky. The windows fogged on the inside, even though the heater was turned up as high as it could go without burning out. My breath hung in front of me like I was smoking, even though I wasn't. The highway just faded into this dull, pale tunnel that the snow kept swallowing, and I caught myself staring at it like it was a hallway in a building I'd never noticed before. You ever stare at something so long, your brain starts filling in details that aren't really there? That's what it felt like. The longer I watched that empty stretch of highway, the more it began to look less like a road and more like a vein, something the town depended on, something that pulsed even when nothing moved. I kept glancing at the clock. Time refused to hurry. It felt like the night wanted to stretch itself out, pull every second thin and translucent so I could see something lurking behind it. Around 2:40 in the morning, the radio slipped into one of those deep static grooves where it sounds like distant whispers are pushing through the noise. I leaned over and tapped it, more out of habit than hope, and I swear to you, right between the hissing and crackling, I heard what sounded like a voice say, very low and very close, "Don't log this one." I froze. You know that feeling when your body goes ahead and reacts before your brain has caught up. My hand stayed on the radio, fingers pressed to the plastic, and every hair on my arm stood up. I told myself it was just a coincidence, my brain stitching meaning into random sound. I turned the radio down until the static was only a faint thread in the background and sat back. That's when I saw the first set of headlights. They appeared out of the snow like 2 pale coins drifting through fog, so soft and slow that for a second I thought they belonged to a parked car being towed. No engine noise, no crunch of tires on the salted strips. Just those lights, gradually growing larger, floating toward the booth. The highway had been empty for almost an hour at that point, so you'd think I'd be relieved to see another living soul on the road. I wasn't. Every instinct in me tightened, like my body knew something I didn't yet have the words for. The car rolled up and stopped at my window, with the same smooth, silent motion. It was an older sedan, dark, coated in a thin layer of salt and ice, but not ancient. Not the kind you'd pick out of a horror movie. Normal enough to blend in, strange enough to be there when nothing else was moving. The window slid down with a sound so soft it hardly registered. The driver leaned toward the opening, and that was the first thing that made my throat go dry. Not the face. The face was unremarkable, the sort of face you lose instantly if someone asked you to describe it. It was the eyes. They weren't glowing or bleeding or doing anything theatrical. They were simply wrong in their calmness. No bleariness from a long drive. No irritation at the snow. Just a steady, even gaze, like I was a page they'd already read and knew by heart. We went through the motions. Amount due. Hand reaching out. Payment passing between fingers. But even that felt off. The bill they gave me was ice cold, like it had been in a freezer all night. I held it a second longer than I should have, feeling that unnatural chill soaked into my skin. The driver's hand hovered there, close enough that if I'd reached a bit farther, I could have touched their wrist. I didn't. Something in me refused. "You should log this one under the old road," the driver said, voice low, like the static I'd heard earlier had stepped into the booth and put on human shape. "I'm sorry," I answered, more out of reflex than curiosity. "The old road," they repeated calmly, tilting their heads slightly toward the stretching highway. "The one they closed. It still takes toll." For a second I thought maybe this was a local joke I just didn't know. There used to be an older route before the main highway expansion. I'd heard people mention it in passing. Something about accidents and bad weather, and a curve they couldn't figure out how to fix. But there was no toll booth on that route, at least not anymore, not officially, and definitely not one staffed. "I just have this station," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "This road only." The driver smiled slowly, like I'd just said something endearingly naive. "You think the system only sees what you see?" That sentence lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. Before I could respond, they leaned slightly closer, their gaze flicking briefly to the logbook on my counter. The logbook, I should mention, was older than the computer system and clearly less reliable, but the company insisted on maintaining it as backup. Every plate, every time, every payment. The record of who passed and when. "You can write it down," the driver murmured, "or you can let the road remember for you. It's better when you let it do the remembering." I don't know why, but something about the way they said "remember" made it sound less like recalling and more like claiming. I looked down at the logbook, pen hovering over the next empty line. When I looked up again, the driver's eyes met mine with such intensity it made my chest feel tight, like I'd inhaled air that was too cold too fast. "Which way are you coming from?" I asked, partly to break the tension, partly because it was what I was supposed to ask. Their answer was quiet. "From where the road ends but doesn't stop." That didn't make any sense, but I knew if I pressed, I'd regret it. So I wrote something down. Random plate numbers, something to fill the line and trick my brain into thinking everything was normal. When I pushed the receipt back toward them, their fingers brushed mine. Not deliberately, not lingering. But that one small contact was enough. It felt like touching the surface of a pond in winter and realizing the ice is thinner than it looks. A cold that had weight. A cold that didn't want to leave. "Thank you," they said with a tiny tilt of the head. Then, almost as an afterthought, "You should check your reflection before your next break." The window slid up. The car eased forward. I waited for the usual crunch of tires as it rolled away, for the diminishing glow of taillights. Instead, the headlights glided back into the snow like they'd never had a car attached to them at all. No engine sound, no red lights shrinking into the distance, just white swallowing everything. I sat there, staring at the place where the car had been, feeling my heart thud against my ribs like it was trying to get out. The booth felt smaller suddenly, not like a workspace, but like a glass jar someone had placed over me. I looked at the logbook. What I thought I'd written was just a line of shaky ink that didn't form any letters I recognized. Not numbers, not letters, just marks, like the kind you'd scratch into a surface if you were trying to keep track of days and lost count. I swallowed and, against my better judgment, turned to look at my reflection in the glass. You know how reflections at night are tricky. If the light inside is bright and the outside is dark, you only see yourself. If it's the other way around, you see nothing. But that moment was something in between. My own face was there, half clear, half obscured by the dim view of the snow beyond. Behind it, faint but unmistakable, I saw the outline of the booth, except it wasn't the one I was sitting in. The walls in the reflection were older, yellowed the way glass gets when it's been around longer than anyone wants to admit. The counter was chipped. The chair behind me in that reflection was metal instead of plastic. And there was someone sitting there, not me. No. Someone with my posture, my tilt of the head, my hands resting in the exact same place on the counter, but older, more worn, eyes that had seen a lot more nights like this. And one more thing. The person in the reflection looked directly at me, even though, by all logic, they should have been looking straight ahead. I jerked back from the glass so hard the stool legs squealed. My heart pounded, pulse roaring in my ears. It had to be a trick of the light, I told myself. A weird overlay of interior and exterior. Fatigue. I hadn't had a proper day off I honestly couldn't remember. I forced myself to lean closer again, inch by inch. This time all I saw was my own face, pale and wide-eyed, with the snow beyond rolling in lazy diagonal sheets. But even then, I noticed something I couldn't shake. In the glass, at the bottom corner where the counter should have been clean, there were faint, vertical scratches. 4. Then a space. Then 4 more. Then another set. Like someone trapped in a small space marking time. I checked the actual counter. Smooth. Nothing. I don't expect you to believe any of this just because I'm saying it. If I were in your place, listening to some stranger talk about ghost reflections and impossible cars at 3 in the morning, I'd be skeptical too. But there's a difference between hearing about something and feeling it. And what I felt in that booth, in that moment, was this. I wasn't the first person to sit there and see that. I was just the latest. The rest of the shift dragged on, every minute stretching, my nerves prickling at each passing gust of wind. But the road stayed empty. No more cars, no trucks, no one. Just that long, pale strip vanishing into the dark. I tried calling in to see if there was a closure or a radio alert I'd missed, but the line gave me nothing. No dial tone, no ring, just a single steady hiss, like someone breathing on the other end and refusing to speak. When the sky finally began to lighten, the snow easing into a gray that hinted at dawn, I found myself staring at the logbook again. At that empty line where I thought I'd written something down. The ink marks had changed. They weren't random anymore. They had resolved into symbols that looked unsettlingly like plate numbers, and they weren't from that night. The dates next to them, small, neat, meticulous, were from years ago, years before I even knew this job existed. My stomach dropped. I flipped back through the pages. Every so often, between the neat columns of entries, there were lines that didn't match the rest. Entries with the same strange, cold feel to the paper. Entries marked under a category I'd never noticed before. All TRT. Alternate route. The old road. Here's the part that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. Near the back of the logbook, on one of the oldest pages, was a small note squeezed into the margin in smaller handwriting. It wasn't a full sentence, just a warning, like someone didn't have enough time or courage to say more. If the car makes no sound, don't acknowledge the eyes. That's all it said. But I did. I looked straight into them. When my replacement showed up that morning, complaining about the cold and the snow and how management never salted the side lane properly, I almost asked if they'd ever seen a car like that. Almost. But the words felt heavy. Like if I spoke them aloud, I'd make something official that wasn't supposed to be. So I just handed over the shift, closed the logbook, and stepped out onto the icy pavement. The cold outside felt normal again. Sharp, sure, but honest. The kind of winter weather you can explain. I walked past the booth window, and without meaning to, glanced at my reflection one more time. Just me. Just the snow. Just the booth. But at the very edge of the glass, where the reflection of the highway cut across the reflection of my shoulder, there was a small smear of something that hadn't been there before. Not condensation, not salt. Just 4 faint vertical lines. Then a space. Then 4 more. If you're ever on a long stretch of highway here on a winter night, and you pass a lonely little booth with its light on, I want you to remember something. If a car in front of you glides a little too quietly, if its lights seem to float instead of shine, if you can't quite hear its tires on the road, do not follow it too closely. Do not stare into the driver's eyes if they turn towards you in their mirrors. And if you ever find yourself on the other side of that glass, behind that counter, with a logbook in front of you and a night so silent it feels like it's listening, don't lean too close to your reflection, because somewhere between the lines of this story and the next one you hear, the road might decide it wants to remember you too. If you're still here with me after all this, let me know in your own words what you think the old road really is, and whether you dare drive it alone on a frozen night. And if this kept you in your seat till now, stay close, hit that subscribe, and come back to Something Scray for the next story the road doesn't want you to hear alone. This didn't happen out on a highway or in some abandoned house. It happened in a cabin that looked completely normal on the outside. Kept up porch, stacked firewood, clean windows, a little plaque by the door with a number, and nothing else. If you drove past it in daylight, you'd probably think, nice place to spend a weekend, and then forget it existed. That's the kind of horror that slips under your skin easiest, the kind that hides behind things that look rented, polished, and safe. I was there alone, or at least I was supposed to be. The cabin sat a few hours outside of town, just far enough into the trees that the only sounds were wind against branches and the occasional distant snowmobile. I'd rented it for one reason: quiet. Not peace, exactly. Just silence. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat and see what your mind does when it isn't being distracted by traffic, phones, and people. Inside, the cabin had that overly clean feel you get in places meant for temporary stays. Neutral furniture, neutral art on the walls, neutral air smelling faintly like old wood, and cleaning spray. There was a fireplace I'd never use, and a little kitchen I barely needed. But the thing that made me choose this cabin over all the other listings was the description of one feature: excellent acoustics in main room, ideal for recording. You might not think about acoustics much in everyday life, but when you record audio, you start noticing how rooms sound the way other people notice how they look. Some rooms swallow your voice. Some rooms make it bounce back at you too harsh. This cabin, according to the reviews, had a soft, warm echo and perfect natural presence. Those were the exact words that pulled me in. Soft, warm, perfect, presence. The first night, I tested it out the way you would if you were sitting in my place. I set up my little recorder on the coffee table, sat on the couch, and just talked. Nothing spooky, just casual stuff. I said what day it was, what time, how long the drive had been, what the snow looked like outside. I wanted a baseline, a clean sample of how the room treated my voice. The heater whispered in the background. The fridge clicked on once. Normal sounds, normal space. When I played it back through my headphones, it did sound good, fuller, closer, like my voice had put on weight. But there was something else, a faint texture in the background that wasn't the heater or the fridge. Just a thin breath of sound between my words, almost too soft to pin down. Not quite an echo, not quite a second voice, more like the room inhaling quietly after every sentence. You ever had that prickling awareness that someone is just behind you, even when every rational part of your brain says you're alone? That's how listening to that first recording felt. Not scary, just crowded, in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. I told myself I was overthinking it. New place, late hour, tired mind. I made dinner, scrolled a bit on my phone until the signal gave up, then went to bed determined not to chase shadows in the sound. But you know this, right? How your mind behaves differently when you're out of your usual environment. The smallest noise feels bigger. So when I woke up at around 3 in the morning to the subtle creak of floorboards in the main room, my body reacted before my thoughts caught up. Heart pounding, throat tight. That old primitive alertness rising up like it had been waiting for its moment. I lay there, frozen, listening. Creak. A slow, deliberate shift. Not the random crack of old wood cooling. A weight moving. I told myself it was the firewood outside settling, or the heater, or anything else that would let me close my eyes again, but the heater wasn't running. The cabin had gone utterly still, the way air freezes when someone steps into a conversation they weren't invited to. After what felt like 20 minutes but was probably only 3, the house went quiet again. Too quiet. Like it was waiting for me to decide what kind of night this was going to be. I didn't go check. Not that night. I'm not going to lie and pretend I marched out bravely. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing, counting my heartbeats, until fatigue finally dragged me under again. In the morning, everything looked normal. No footprints on the floor, no open doors, no drawers left ajar, just a faint chill in the main room that hadn't been there the previous evening, like the kind of coolness a person leaves in a chair after they've been sitting for a while. That's when the idea crept in, not as a sudden inspiration, but as a slow, insistent thought. Use the recorder again. Not just to test the room this time, to listen to the night. I know what you're thinking. It's the same thing I would think if you told me this story. Don't invite whatever you don't understand to introduce itself. Don't give it a voice. But curiosity has a way of pretending to beat bravery, and I let it. That second night, I set the recorder on the same coffee table, checked the battery, and hit record just before I went to bed. No intro, no commentary. I wanted pure ambient sound, just the cabin being itself for a few hours. I slept better than the night before, deep, heavy sleep that felt almost drugged, but with that kind where you know you've had dreams and can't remember a single image from them. Just the feeling of being watched, not from across the room, from above. Like my thoughts had not been entirely my own while I was unconscious. In the morning, there it was. 5 hours and 19 minutes of audio, neatly captured, waiting for me. I made coffee, sat down on the couch with my headphones, and pressed play, bracing myself for, honestly, I didn't know what. I just knew my heart rate went up before the first second even rolled by. The first hour was unremarkable. A faint hum from somewhere in the walls, the occasional tick of the baseboard, my own breathing in the distance as I shifted in my sleep. There's something strangely intimate about listening to yourself unconscious, vulnerable in a way you don't get to see, only hear. Around the 1 hour mark, the cabin settled deeper into quiet. That's when another sound slipped in, soft at first, a murmur. Not like a voice yet, more like the rustle of fabric or someone rubbing their hands together slowly. It circled the edges of the recording, a faint, irregular hiss, closer, then farther, then closer again. I paused the playback, pulled the headphones off, and just sat there for a second, reminding myself that whatever I heard was already over. I wasn't in it. I was listening to it. I put the headphones back on and kept going. At 1 hour and 22 minutes, the sound became clearer. Less fabric, more breath. Not mine. I checked. My breathing during sleep had its own rhythm, soft and even, coming from the right channel, where the bedroom was relative to the recorder. This new sound came from directly in front of the device. Slow inhales, slow exhales, right there, as if someone had leaned over the coffee table and was listening to the silence as intently as I was listening now. I whispered something, half a dream word, and rolled over. The breathing paused like it was startled. Then something scraped gently against the table, a finger maybe, or a nail, and then, in a tone so low I had to rewind 3 times to make sure I wasn't hearing my own imagination, a voice spoke. "I hear you." Those 3 words slipped through my headphones like ice water down the spine. They weren't distorted. They weren't monstrous. They sounded normal, almost steady, the way someone might speak into a mic to check levels. I heard myself shift again, a small snore, oblivious. The voice came back, a little closer to the recorder. "I hear you," it repeated softly. "Do you hear me?" My mouth went dry. I paused the playback again, staring at the little device sitting on the table in front of me. It looked so harmless. Simple buttons, tiny screen, a red light indicating nothing more than battery level. No sign that, at some point during the night, my rented cabin had hosted a conversation that only one of us knew was happening. I thought about stopping there, deleting the file, packing up and leaving under the excuse of bad sleep and too much coffee. But if you've made it this far with me, you know that isn't what happened. Curiosity, again. Or maybe something else, something that wanted to be finished listening to. I pressed play. The breathing continued. Slow. Patient. The voice didn't use full sentences at first, just small phrases scattered between minutes of silence. "Cold tonight. Too quiet. You brought it?" That last one made my stomach twist. I wanted to argue with it, even though it was a recording. I hadn't brought anything. I'd come with luggage and groceries and a laptop, nothing else. But the voice sounded sure, in a way that made my defenses feel childish. At 2 hours and some minutes in, I heard something I still don't know how to explain clearly. A sound like pages turning, not from any book I owned. I hadn't brought paper. I hadn't left anything on that table except the recorder. But there it was, the soft flit of paper edges being flipped through. The voice murmured again, closer this time, almost intimate in my ears. "You talk a lot when you're awake. You don't listen." I wanted to say, "I'm listening now." The thought came with a wave of nausea, as if the recording wasn't just a record, but a live line, a thread between then and now. On the audio, the breathing shifted, moving slightly to the left, like whoever, or whatever, it was had walked around the table. I heard a faint exhale right into the mic, then a single, clear question. "Do you want to hear what this room remembers?" There was no answer from sleeping me. Of course there wasn't, but the voice acted as if it had permission anyway. The next sound was different, layered. For a second, the audio glitched, or that's what I told myself. The ambient hum changed, deepened, and underneath it, other sounds rose up, woven together in a way that made my skin crawl. Different voices, overlapping, different times bleeding into each other, laughing, crying, someone humming tunelessly, a chair scraping, a door slamming, a muffled stop from a throat that sounded unfamiliar but human. All of it condensed into a kind of low thrumming chorus, like the room itself had started playing back every sound it had ever absorbed since the cabin was built. Every fight, every secret phone call, every late-night confession, every whispered, "don't tell." You know when you listen to something so intense, your chest tightens because your body doesn't know how to process it all? That's what it felt like. I had to remind myself over and over, these are recordings within a recording. The past replayed. They can't reach you. They're already done, over, finished. Except one of the voices suddenly wasn't. Right at 3 hours and 12 minutes, every overlapping noise cut off like a door slamming, leaving only one voice, right in front of the mic. "Not finished," it said quietly. "Not yours. Ours." The last word dragged just a little. Not like a threat, but like a claim. I stopped the playback there. My hands were shaking. The cabin around me felt different now, less like a rental and more like a container. A vessel. I got up, paced, tried to shake the feeling off. But once you've heard something like that, the walls never look the same again. They don't just enclose space, they hold history. That afternoon, I walked the property, pretending I was just getting fresh air. Snow clung to the branches. The sky was low and heavy, that dull gray that makes late afternoon look like early evening. I circled the building, looking for something. An explanation, maybe. Fresh tracks, signs of break-in. Anything to anchor the experience to an ordinary source. Nothing. Perfect clean snow around the cabin. The only footprints were my own from when I'd first arrived. When the sun started to drop, I knew I had a choice. Leave early, drive back on half-slept nerves, and file this whole thing under weird but done. Or stay one more night and try something I wasn't sure was a good idea. You already know which one I chose, because you're still here with me. That night, I put the recorder on the table again, checked the battery, hit record. But this time, I didn't go straight to bed. I sat on the couch in the dark main room, lights off, listening to the faint ticking of the house as the temperature dropped. And then, because it felt ridiculous and inevitable all at once, I spoke into the shadows. "I heard you," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. I listened to what you played back. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the air shifted. Not dramatically, just a subtle tightening, like the sensation you get right before a storm hits, when the sky seems to lean closer. My voice would be on the recording now too, of course. A layer on top of the old layers. A new imprint. I didn't bring anything with me, I added softer. If something's here, it was here before I got here. In the stillness that followed, a floorboard to my right creaked. Not random, not settling. One isolated, responsive sound. I felt an urge rise in me, a thought that didn't quite feel like my own. Ask it. Ask what it wants. Instead, I asked something simpler. How long have you been listening? The answer didn't come in words right away. It came in a faint, delayed echo of my own voice. Not like a digital effect, but like the room trying to repeat me in a slightly different tone. How long? The air whispered. My own voice stretched and reshaped. Then, overlapping it, a different tone slid in, quiet but unmistakable. Longer than you think, it said, not just here. Anywhere you speak and forget the room is hearing you. That was enough. I reached forward, hands fumbling, and stopped the recording. The red light blinked off. The device went silent. The cabin for a moment felt like it exhaled, disappointed. I didn't sleep much that last night. When I did drift off, it was with the sense that if I started talking in my sleep again, something would be waiting to archive every word. In the morning, I didn't listen to that final file. I deleted it without playing a second. Call it cowardice, call it self-preservation. But there's a difference between knowing something happened and giving it a second life by listening to it again. I left the key on the counter, closed the door behind me, didn't look back at the windows. Here's the part that stuck with me, though. And it's why I'm telling you this, like we're alone together in a quiet room right now. Every space you've ever been in has heard you. Your bedroom, your car, your office, the hallway where you whispered something you thought vanished after the words left your mouth. Sound doesn't just disappear. It changes form. It clings. And some places, like that cabin, feel less like rooms and more like archives. So when you talk out loud to yourself, or when you tell a story thinking no one's really listening, just remember this. Maybe it's not about who else is in the room with you. Maybe it's about the room itself. Maybe it's been listening longer than you've been alive. Maybe it's waiting for someone like you to sit down, press play, and finally hear it talk back. If you felt the walls around you a little more while you listen to this, tell me in your own words what kind of room you'd never dare record in, and why. And if you want to stay close for the next story the walls aren't done telling, stick with Something Scray, because some rooms don't like it when you only listen once. You know how some places feel empty but the land around them feels busy? That's how the orchard felt the first time I stepped into it, and if you stay with me, You'll understand why I don't walk near frozen trees anymore. I'm going to talk to you like you're right here beside me, because that's the only way this really makes sense, like I'm walking you through it row by row. This wasn't a cabin, or a highway, or a little room with nice acoustics. This was open air, wide sky, and trees lined up in such straight, obedient rows that at first you'd think nothing chaotic could ever happen there. Orchards are supposed to feel peaceful. This one felt organized, like something had taken the time to sort its secrets into neat, repeating lines. The orchard sat on the edge of a small Ontario town, the kind of place that doesn't show up in travel blogs, just in weather alerts. I took a winter job there because I needed money fast, and it paid better than stacking shelves. It wasn't harvesting season. The fruit was long gone. Winter work was all about pruning, checking for damage, and making sure nothing collapsed under the weight of ice. Most people avoid orchards in winter. They look like skeletons, bare branches reaching up as if asking for something no one wants to give. The first morning, the owner walked me around the property. The snow came up over my boots in places, crusted and uneven, covering the low grass and the black irrigation lines like they were veins beneath skin. The trees stood still and quiet, each trunk tagged with a little metal marker. I remember running my glove over one of them and feeling the stamped numbers. A row, a variety, a year. It was all very official, very agricultural. Nothing about it screamed wrong yet. "Wind can do strange things out here," the owner said, nodding toward the far end of the orchard, where the trees seemed to crowd closer together. "If you hear anything, voices, whatever, just remember sound carries. This place echoes." I laughed politely, the way you do when someone brushes up against something eerie but tries to make it a joke. Voices, wind, whatever. There was a tiredness in the way it was said that stuck with me, though, like someone repeating a rule they knew you probably wouldn't follow. The work itself was simple. Check the branches for breaks. Knock off heavy clumps of snow before they snapped under the weight. Look for signs of disease. Long, repetitive days of moving up and down the rows, breath steaming in front of me, gloves stiffening with the cold. I got used to the sound of my own footsteps, the crunch, the soft thuds of snow hitting the ground when I shook the branches. But as the days got colder, the sound began to change. At first, it was just something small, a murmur on the edge of hearing when the wind slipped through the bare branches. Not words exactly, just an impression of speech. The kind of noise that makes your brain lean forward, trying to pick out syllables. You've heard it in crowded rooms, that low human hum that says you're not alone, even if you can't catch a sentence. Except there was no crowd, just me, the frozen rows, and a sky that seemed to get lower every afternoon. One afternoon, I stayed later than usual. A shipment had been delayed, and the owner wanted at least half the north section cleared before another round of freezing rain hit. The light went from gray to that deep blue that makes all shadows look taller. My phone died. The last of the car sounds from the road faded. It was just me and the trees. That's when I heard it properly. I was standing between two rows, knocking ice from a branch, when a voice drifted over from somewhere to my left. Clear, distinct. Close enough that my heart jumped because I was sure someone was standing in the next row. "Hey," it said, almost conversational. "You're late." I snapped around, my breath catching. No one. Just lines of trees, their branches etched against the darkening sky, frost gathering along the bark. I waited, listening, every muscle tight. After a moment, I heard it again, softer, like it had retreated. "You're late," it repeated, not accusing, just stating. I forced myself to answer because silence felt worse. "I'm just finishing this line," I called back, trying to sound calm. "Who's there?" Nothing moved, no crunch of steps, no shifting of branches, just a faint, dry rustle, like old paper being folded. I told myself it was the wind working some weird trick. Maybe it had dragged a radio signal in from somewhere. Maybe there were kids nearby playing a prank. 100 maybe explanations lined up in my head, all of them flimsy, but better than "the trees are talking." I went back to work, but my ears wouldn't let it go. Every tiny sound felt magnified: the crackle of ice, the whisper of my coat, the small sighing groans of trunks adjusting to the cold. The more I listened, the more it all started to sound like a language I didn't quite speak. As I moved farther toward the back of the orchard, something else started happening. The little metal markers on the trunks changed. Near the front, they just had row and tree numbers, ordinary. But back there, some of them had extra markings scratched into the metal. Initials, dates, tiny symbols. One had a small, crudely carved X over the printed number. Another had a set of 4 vertical lines and a diagonal slash through them, like someone counting time. I stopped at one that looked newer than the rest, the scratches less weathered. The stamped number was partially obscured by a pattern etched over it. It wasn't any letter I recognized, just a shape that looked almost like a name someone had started and never finished. The air felt heavier there. Still. The kind of stillness that makes your own breathing feel too loud. "You shouldn't linger in that row." The voice came from behind me this time, close enough that I spun around so fast I nearly slipped. Again, no one. Just the trees, perfectly spaced, the snow unbroken between them. "All right," I said out loud because pretending not to hear wasn't helping. "If someone's out here, this isn't funny." No answer. But a few rows over, something brushed against the branches in a soft, rippling wave, like fingers moving along a zipper. I told myself I was done for the day. Enough was enough. I marked my place, turned, and started back toward the front, where the small shed and the road lights were. With every step, though, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. Not from one direction, but from all sides. Like walking between people who had all agreed not to make a sound, but hadn't agreed not to stare. You've felt that before, right? In a crowded place that suddenly goes quiet. That moment where stillness feels louder than noise. It was that, but stretched out into a long, uneasy walk, each row of trees feeling like it had eyes at the height of the knots in the trunks. I made it out, locked up, and told myself I was being dramatic. New job, isolated setting, winter playing tricks. That night, though, when I lay down, the orchard followed me into sleep. I dreamed of the rows bending in, branches knitting over my head, metal markers clinking softly as they swung like tiny bells. The next morning, I wasn't supposed to go in. The forecast called for a bad freeze, and the owner texted to say we'd hold off a day. But as I sat at home, staring at the wall, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something unfinished. Not work. A conversation. By noon, the sky had turned a dull silver, the kind of light that doesn't know if it wants to be snow or rain. I decided to drive out there anyway, just to check things. The way you might go back to check a locked door, even though you know you locked it. The orchard was empty. No other cars. No footprints except old ones already softened by new powder. The shed stood quiet. I let myself in, grabbed my gloves and tools, and told myself I'd just walk a couple of rows, make sure the branches I'd cleared were holding. The air felt different. Colder, but more than that, expectant. Like stepping into a room where people have been talking about you and abruptly stop. I walked 2 rows, 3, 4. My breath puffed in front of me. My boots left dark tracks. Everything seemed normal, if a little too quiet. I almost convinced myself to leave, chalk everything up to an overactive brain, when I noticed something at the base of one of the trees. The metal marker looked like the others, but the snow beneath it had melted in a perfect circle, maybe a foot wide, right down to the dead grass. In the middle of that circle, carved shallowly into the frozen ground, was a date. Not today's. A winter day from years before. The air bit into my lungs as I breathed in. More markers ahead of me. More little melted circles around certain trees, each with a date, some faded, some sharp, some accompanied by initials scratched into the bark above. You know that feeling when you realize you've been looking at something every day, but only just now understand what it means. That's what hit me. These weren't just tree tags. They were records, not of plantings, of something else. I backed away, heart hammering, and that's when the voices started again. Not one this time, but many, soft, overlapping, threaded through the branches like wind catching on bells. Too late. Don't leave yet. See us. They weren't angry. They weren't shouting. They sounded eager, hungry, but not for food, for attention. I've heard recordings of crowds in big cities. This wasn't like that. This was smaller, tighter, like a handful of people whispering in a circle. My brain scrambled to find a normal explanation. Maybe there were houses I couldn't see nearby, and sound was bouncing weirdly. Maybe, look at the sap, one voice cut through, clearer than the rest. I don't know why I listened. Maybe because ignoring a direct instruction in a place that already felt personal was beyond me at that point. I stepped closer to the tree with the closest whisper, and there it was. Along a shallow cut in the bark, sap had frozen mid-drip, captured in thin golden streaks. Most of it was opaque with frost, but one droplet near the bottom was still clear, like a bead of glass. Inside that droplet, something tiny was suspended, dark, thread-like. At first, I thought it was just debris, but when I leaned in, breath fogging in front of my face, I realized it looked like writing. Minuscule strokes, a curve, a line, a shape that didn't belong to any alphabet I knew. The voices swelled softly around me like a breeze picking up. "Read it," one urged. "I can't," I whispered before I could stop myself. "I don't know how." A slow creak passed down the row as branches shifted, ice cracking along their length. The sound formed its own kind of sentence. If you've ever heard snow slide off a roof in one smooth sheet, that was close, sudden, comprehensive. The droplet of sap shimmered. For a heartbeat, I saw something impossible. My own reflection in that tiny bead, distorted and thin. My face, my eyes small and trapped in that amber-like prison. Then a sharp sting sparked at the back of my neck like a static shock, and I stumbled backward. "You're marked now," a voice whispered so close to my ear that I spun around, certain someone was standing right behind me. No one. Just trees. Tags. Snow. I ran then. Not a dignified fast walk. A full-out boot-slipping sprint back toward the front. The voices didn't chase me physically, but they followed in my head, each step setting them off like pressure plates. "Don't go. Stay until the thaw. You came back. That's consent." I burst out of the rows into the open space near the shed, lungs burning, legs trembling. The silence out there hit me like a wall. No voices, no whispers. Just my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the town. I didn't lock up properly. I didn't even take my tools. I got in the car with hands still shaking and drove back to town, checking the rearview mirror too often, half expecting to see lines of bare trees moving where there should have been fields. That night, I didn't dream. I lay awake, listening to every small noise in my room, waiting for the sound of bending branches or soft, dry whispers. None came. But sometime around dawn, I noticed something on my pillow. A faint, sticky streak near where my neck had been. I touched the back of my neck with my fingers, heart pounding. There was a tacky spot there, almost invisible. When I pulled my hand back, there was a smear of something pale and yellowish on my fingertips. Not blood, not sweat. Sap. You ever feel a chill that isn't about temperature, but about the realization that you took something with you from a place that didn't want to stay there? That's what wrapped around me then. I scrubbed my neck, washed the pillowcase, told myself there had to be a mundane explanation. Resin from some wooden thing I'd leaned against, glue from a tag. Any excuse. The next day, the owner called. "We're shutting the orchard for the season earlier than planned," they said. "Weather's turning, you don't have to come back." I almost said, I already went out there yesterday. I almost told them about the dates, the voices, the sap. But something in their tone stopped me. A tiredness, a relief. Like they'd been waiting for a reason to close that didn't sound superstitious. So I just said, okay, and hung up. I haven't been back since. I've driven past the turnoff a few times, once in spring, once in summer, once in early fall. Each time the trees looked normal from the road, green, leafy, harmless, the kind of place families might stop at for apple picking and photos. I wonder sometimes if they ever notice the tags, the little circles of melting snow, the way the wind sounds different between certain rows. But this is the part that ties you into it, whether you want it or not. Since that winter, sometimes when I'm out walking near any cluster of trees, even little decorative ones in town, if I stop and stand very still, I swear I can hear it again. Not words anymore, just a sense. Like a crowd trying to remember my face, like a row of something unseen lining up just behind the trunks waiting. I don't think the orchard wanted to hurt me. I think it wanted something worse, to be remembered, to keep its own ledgers in sap and frost and metal tags, and to mark the occasional person who listened a bit too closely. So if you ever find yourself walking through rows of bare trees in the cold, and the wind starts to sound just a little too much like whispers, do one thing for me. Look at the bark. Look at the little markers. See if there are dates that don't make sense, scratches that don't match the stamped numbers, little beads of sap that haven't frozen when everything else has. And if you spot your reflection in one of them, even just for a second, don't lean closer. Don't let it learn your face more than it already has. If you felt the rows around you tightening while you listen to this, tell me what kind of place you think keeps the deepest secrets. Fields, forests, or something else entirely. And if you want to walk into the next story with me, where the land keeps count in its own quiet way, stay close to Something Scray, because not every map shows you what's already written in the trees. You ever notice how some buildings look normal in the day, but at night, every window starts to feel like an eye? That's the kind of place this was. A regular Ontario high-rise that only turned strange when the snow piled high and the city went quiet. I want you to imagine you're right here with me, because that's how I remember it. Not as a story I'm telling after the fact, but as something I'm still sitting in. I lived on the 12th floor of a concrete apartment block, the kind you barely notice when you drive past. Same beige paint, same square balconies, same hum of vents and distant TVs. It was the kind of place people moved into when they were in between things. In between jobs, in between relationships, in between better plans. I took it because it was close to the hospital where I worked nights, and because the rent was cheap enough that I didn't ask why. You learn a building's personality fast when you work nights. You learn which doors slam at the same time every evening, which neighbors fight, which ones drag furniture for no reason at 2 a.m. You learn the rhythm of the elevators, the good one and the bad one. In my building, we had 3 cars. 2 worked most of the time. The third didn't. Or at least that's what the superintendent said. The button for that one was always taped over. Out of service. Written in black marker that had been retraced so many times the paper was more ink than tape. I never questioned it. Why would I? Elevators break. Old buildings stay old. Life goes on. The winter that changed things wasn't special at first, just colder than usual. Snow layered itself on the sidewalks in thick, reluctant piles. The plows couldn't keep up. People stayed inside more. My night shifts got longer as the ER filled with slips, falls, frostbite, and all the other ways cold finds to remind us who's really in charge up here. One night, after a brutal 12-hour shift, I came home to find the lobby almost empty. Just the security guard at the desk, eyes glued to his phone, and the faint smell of wet boots and industrial cleaner. Outside, the snow hadn't stopped all day. It plastered itself against the glass doors, turning the world beyond into a blurry white smear. I hit the call button for the elevator like I always did. The middle one chimed, doors sliding open with their usual tired sigh. I stepped in, pressed 12, leaned back, and let my brain drift for a second. That in-between moment where you're not at work anymore, but you're not home yet either. Just floating in a metal box between two lives. The car started up, and then, somewhere between the 5th and 6th floors, it shuddered. You know that tiny hitch you feel sometimes in elevators? That little drop that lasts half a second and makes your stomach growl at your brain. This was longer. A full-body jolt followed by a long, queasy pause. The lights flickered. The hum of motion stuttered into silence. I stood up straight, heart thudding. The panel went dark for a heartbeat, then blinked back to life. Only this time, the floor indicator didn't show 6 or 7. It showed nothing, just a single horizontal line. Like the elevator had decided it was nowhere at all. I hit the door open button. Nothing. Door close. Nothing. I pressed 12 again, then 11, then 1. The buttons lit up and stayed lit, but the car didn't move. The emergency phone box sat just below the buttons, a little metal door with a chipped corner. I flipped it open, grabbed the handset, and pressed it to my ear, already anticipating the tinny pre-recorded message. No message, just a low, steady static. It reminded me of the sound you get on an old TV when it's between channels, where if you listen long enough you start thinking you hear patterns in the noise. "Hello," I said, because that's what you say, even when you know no one can hear you. The middle elevator's stuck. Between floors, I think. Can someone... I stopped. Under the static, there was another sound. Soft. Slow. The rhythm didn't match my breathing. It didn't match the faint mechanical hum behind the walls. It was more like a shallow inhale. A pause. A shallow exhale. Over and over. It sounded like someone was already on the line, just listening. "Hello?" I repeated, quieter this time. The breathing paused. For a second, the static thinned, like someone had covered the receiver on the other end. Then, in a voice so faint, I almost convinced myself I imagined it, I heard, "Wrong car." My grip tightened on the handset. "What?" Static rushed back like a wave hitting shore. The breathing disappeared. No more voice. Just that endless hiss. I hung up, swallowing against the dryness in my throat. My mind did that frantic thing where it tries to categorize. Prank, glitch, old recording, stress. Anything but someone who shouldn't be there is talking to you through a line that shouldn't be live. The panel chimed softly. The floor indicator flickered. Then, instead of a number, a small red letter appeared. L. We didn't have an L button. No lobby. That was 1. No lower. No parking. No lockdown. No L anything. Just numbers from 1 to 18 and a basement marked B. The car lurched downward, with a slow, heavy motion that didn't feel like the usual smooth glide. This felt hesitant, like the building was thinking about each foot of descent. I wanted to hit stop. I really did. But some part of me needed to know where it was taking me. You ever get that? That urge to see something through, even though every instinct is screaming at you to bail out? That's what pinned my hand to my side. The elevator settled with a dull thump. The light over the door blinked. The car went still. The doors slid open. It wasn't the lobby. It wasn't any floor I recognized. The first thing that hit me was the temperature. The air outside the car felt colder than the air inside, like I'd just opened a freezer. My breath puffed out in a thicker cloud than it had in the parking lot. The second thing was the smell. Old dust and something else underneath. Faint, like antiseptic that had soaked into things decades ago and never fully left. I stepped forward, just far enough to look out. The hallway beyond was narrow and long, stretching left and right. The walls were painted a shade of white that had yellowed over time. The floor was linoleum, cracked in places with small patterns worn smooth where many feet had walked. Low fluorescent lights hummed overhead, throwing out a sickly, vibrating glow. There were doors, spaced evenly along the walls, not apartment doors. These were narrower, each with a small rectangular window at eye level and a metal plaque underneath. The plaques didn't have numbers. They had words. Ward A, Ward B, Exam 3, Storage, Observation. I know hospital words. I live in them. Seeing them down there, in a building that was supposed to be all residential, made my skin crawl. I turned back to the panel, expecting to see some sign of a mistake. A different building designation. Some clue. The buttons were the same. The indicator still showed L, glowing steadily. Behind me, somewhere down the hall, something clicked. A door latch, soft and precise. Wrong car, the voice had said. I should have hit door close and stayed right there, hugging my confusion and fear until the car decided to move. Instead, something else took over. That ugly mix of exhaustion, training, and curiosity. If this was some kind of weird, hidden floor, old medical wing maybe, forgotten during renovations, I needed to know if someone else was down there, if someone needed help. "Hello?" I called out, stepping fully into the corridor. The floor felt hard and cold through my boots. My voice sounded small against the low ceiling. "Is anyone here?" No answer, but the lights buzzed a little louder, as if they'd perked up. I took a few steps to the left. The first door on that side had a plaque that simply read, Exam 1. The glass in the window was wired, the kind that doesn't shatter easily. It was fogged slightly on the inside, like the room beyond had a different temperature than the hallway. I leaned closer, trying to peer through. At first, all I saw was a vague outline of a bed and a chair. Then, slowly, another shape resolved itself, something standing in the corner, tall and indistinct. For a moment, my brain wanted it to be a coat rack. It had that shape, upright, narrow. I even looked for the little hooks extending from it. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized there were no hooks. Just the suggestion of shoulders. A thicker darkness where a head might be. And this was the part that twisted my stomach. A faint reflection in the glass, layered over my own. Another face, not quite lined up with mine, watching from the other side. A soft, muffled sound drifted through the door. Not a word. More like a breath pressed against a hand over a mouth. I jerked back, pulse roaring in my ears. Every instinct finally agreed. This is not for you. Go back. Leave. Now. I turned to retreat to the elevator and froze. The car was still there. Doors open. Light on inside. But the panel that had shown L was now blank. No letter. No number. Just a dark screen. The door closed. Button's light was off. "Okay," I said, my voice shaking. "Okay. This is enough. I get it. A noise cut me off. From further down the hall, one of the other doors creaked open an inch. The sound was painfully slow, like old hinges resisting. A thin strip of darkness appeared in the gap, darker than the already dim hall. Then another door, and another. Soft squeals of metal giving way, one after the other. Wards A and B, Observation, Storage, Exam 2 and 3. Each opening just enough to say, someone could slip out through here if they wanted to. The hallway filled with a new sound. Not voices, not yet. Just movement, subtle. The shuffle of something soft dragging along the floor. The faint brush of fabric. Something tapping once, twice, 3 times against a wall. My mind threw up images of patients in old photographs. Pale gowns, slippered feet, hands fidgeting with IV lines. Except there were no IV poles here. No machines, no carts. Just doors, and that humming light. I took a step back toward the elevator. The air grew colder around my ankles like a draft was sweeping along the floor from all those newly opened gaps. "Wrong car," the voice had said. I had a sudden vivid image of the normal elevators in the building, rising and descending, their cables churning, going where they were meant to go. And this car, this middle one, slipping its track just enough to slide sideways, into something the building hadn't quite let go of. "Who's there?" I called out again, hating how afraid I sounded but needing to anchor myself to something. If someone needs help, you need to say so. There was a pause, the kind of pause that feels like the whole world is inhaling at once. Then, from the nearest slightly open door, a voice answered. Not loud, not dramatic, just tired. We did, it whispered. They moved us instead. The words sank into me with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. I knew that tone. I'd heard it in real patients, the ones transferred off busy floors to quieter wings, the ones shuffled between departments, their charts scribbled with orders no one read properly anymore. They moved us, plural. A group, I swallowed. Moved you? Where? Down, another voice answered from further along, this one raspier. Then over, then out of mind, never out of rooms. The hallway seemed to tilt. The little rectangular windows in the doors flickered faint reflections of the overhead lights, making it look like eyes opening and closing. I didn't want to ask the next question, I didn't, but it pushed its way out of me anyway. Are you alive? There was a soft rustle, like people shifting on beds at the same time. Were, the first voice said. Long enough to hear the machine stop, long enough to feel them forget the floor exists. A bitter little laugh echoed from somewhere deeper in the hall. Keeps the building quiet up there, a third voice muttered. No complaints when you don't remember where you put the complaints. I pressed my back against the elevator frame, fingers groping behind me for the panel. The metal felt slick under my shaking hand. I found the door close button and started hitting it. Nothing. You don't belong here, I said, anger rising to cover the fear. I don't belong here. I'm sorry for what happened to you, but this isn't for you, the tired voice finished, almost gently. We know. You're not the first to say that. The hallway seemed to stretch longer as they spoke, doors receding into a false distance. My vision tunneled, a halo of black creeping in at the edges. I kept stabbing the button, like a reflex. You asked who needed help, the raspier one said. We still do, but not the kind you know, not anymore. A soft dragging sound moved closer from the left, then from the right, the sensation of being at the center of a slow tightening circle. We remember the floors, another voice said, softer and softer, as if walking down a long corridor toward me. We remember the nurses. We remember the beeping. We remember no one telling us why the lights went out and never came back on. The air grew so cold my teeth began to chatter. My breath poured out in thick clouds. The lights overhead flickered, buzzing angrily, like insects trapped in frost. Finally, the elevator reacted. The door close button lit up under my thumb. The motor above groaned. The doors began to move. Not the smooth, confident slide I was used to, but a stuttering, reluctant inching, like invisible hands were resisting from the outside. An edge of the hallway narrowed as the gap shrank. In that narrowing slice of view, I saw shapes in the open doorways. Just silhouettes, just shadows, but too many, too close, standing in the thresholds, watching. One of them glided forward, just enough that the overhead light caught the outline of a face in the nearest window. I couldn't make out features, only the suggestion of eyes sunk deeper than they should have been, and a mouth that didn't quite line up right with where it should be. Wrong car, the tired voice said again. Right listener. The doors met in the middle with a shuddering clunk. The car jerked. The L on the panel blinked, then changed. Just like that. The ascent back up felt too fast and too slow at the same time. When the doors finally opened onto my regular hallway, the scuffed carpet, the flickering exit sign, the smell of someone cooking something with garlic, I stepped out like I was crawling out of water after nearly drowning. Everything looked the same. Ordinary. Boring even. I walked to my door in a daze, shut it behind me, and leaned back against it. The building hummed around me. Pipes, TVs. Human life in boxes stacked on top of each other. For a few nights after that, I avoided the middle elevator. I took the stairs when I could. If one of the other cars opened, I stepped into it with my jaw clenched, heart thudding, braced for the floor indicator to glitch again. It didn't. Days passed, then weeks. The snow melted. Slush replaced ice. People stopped complaining about the cold and started complaining about potholes. Part of me started to believe I'd cracked under fatigue for a moment. That stress and night shifts had stitched a hallucination together out of hospital corridors and elevator noises. I wanted to believe that, until I noticed the paper on the middle elevator button. The out-of-service tape had been replaced. New strip, fresh ink, same words. But someone had added something in smaller handwriting at the bottom. In a rushed, cramped scrawl. If it lights up by itself, it said, "Take the stairs." I stared at that note for a long time, heart thudding. My fingers tingled. I looked around the lobby, half expecting someone to be watching me. No one was, just the security guard, scrolling his phone. One evening, when I came home late again, juggling a grocery bag and my keys, the middle elevator dinged before I touched any button. Its doors slid open. The inside was empty, lights on, floor indicator glowing with a steady 1, waiting. I took the stairs. So here's the part where it stops being just my story and starts brushing against yours. You've ridden elevators late at night. You've watched the numbers tick by. You've heard the cables strain and the walls shift. If you ever see a floor you don't recognize, a letter instead of a number, a stop that wasn't supposed to happen, don't step out just because the door's open. Don't tell yourself it's a shortcut or a curiosity worth exploring. And if you work in a building that's clearly newer than any hospital, but you hear words like ward or observation in the empty space below your feet, remember, sometimes they don't demolish everything. Sometimes they just build on top and let whatever's underneath keep existing in the cracks. If you felt that cold in your chest while I was talking, tell me what you would have done when those doors opened on the wrong floor. And if you're ready to hear what's waiting on the next level down, stay close to Something Scray, because some stories don't need stairs or buttons to find you. You know how some places don't look like they're on the way to anywhere, but somehow you always end up passing them anyway. That's what this story's about. A highway motel that felt less like a stop and more like something waiting for you to run out of options. Picture this like you're in the passenger seat with me late at night. Heater on full blast, wipers smearing freezing rain across the windshield. I'd been driving transport runs for a couple of winters by then. Ontario back roads, long-haul stretches between distribution centers. The kind of routes where your only company is radio static and the occasional trucker's voice cutting through like a ghost. You start measuring time in gas stops and coffee refills. Town names blur. Landmarks fade into each other. But there was one place on my run that refused to blur. It sat off a lonely stretch of highway that never felt fully plowed, no matter how many storms had passed. A low, one-story motel with a flickering sign that said Northwind in tired neon. You know the type. Doors that open straight onto the parking lot, curtains that never quite close all the way, an office with a bell on the counter and a television murmuring to itself somewhere in the back. I'd passed it a dozen times, always telling myself the same thing. Not there. Not unless I have no other choice. Then one winter night, the highway decided to run out on me. Freezing rain had started around dusk. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a fine, invisible layer that turned the asphalt into something halfway between glass and oil. Dispatch said it was manageable. My gut said it wasn't, but the delivery window was tight, and I'd already been running behind thanks to a loading dock problem at the last stop. So I kept going, hands clenched a little too hard on the wheel, eyes burning from squinting through the glare. You ever notice how the world starts shrinking when you're tired? The road narrows. The beams of your headlights feel shorter. The dark on either side of the highway seems hungrier. That's where I was at around midnight when the snow started joining the rain, thick wet flakes slapping against the glass, instantly freezing in streaks that the wipers smeared instead of cleared. I slowed down, then slowed more. No other headlights in sight, front or back. No taillights to follow, just my own truck engine grinding away, each gear change sounding too loud in the cocoon of the cab. At some point, the road just disappeared. Not literally, of course. The paint was already long buried, but that familiar sense of edges, of shoulder and ditch, of curve and straightaway, it all blurred into one pale, glowing ribbon. My back started to ache from leaning forward. My eyes hurt. I blinked, hard, trying to clear that grainy feeling sleep puts behind your eyelids. For a couple of seconds, only a couple, I must have actually nodded off. You know that violent snap when your chin drops and your head jerks back up like someone yanked a string. That hit me so hard, it felt like my skull rattled. In that instant, the truck drifted just an inch too far to the right. The tire caught on something soft. The whole rig shivered, weight shifting. My hands clamped the wheel. I corrected too fast. The back end fishtailed. The world went sideways in the windshield. Somehow, by accident or instinct, I managed to ride it out. When the truck finally settled again, my heart pounding so loudly it sounded like an extra engine, I knew two things very clearly. If I kept going, I was going to end up in a ditch. And I had no idea exactly where I was anymore. No other exits. No visible signs. Just the endless smear of white. That's when I saw the north wind sign. It rose out of the storm on the right like it had been pulled up on a string, neon flickering weakly, half the letters out. Northwee. A few dim yellow bulbs traced the outline of a low building behind it. The parking lot was scraped but already filling with fresh slush. I could have sworn that stretch of highway was still miles away. I'd passed it enough to have a rough mental map. But there it was, sitting closer than it had any right to be, like the storm had folded the road over itself just to drop me in front of it. I told myself something sensible. Better to sleep in a sketchy motel than die in a snowbank. That's the sentence that got me to take the exit. That, and the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking from adrenaline. The lot was almost empty. One car near the office, half buried. A truck cab with no trailer, nose in near the end. The motel itself looked tired. Not ruined, not overtly creepy. Just worn out in that particular way roadside places get, where you can feel thousands of brief lives passing through. Arguments, affairs, breakdowns, reconciliations, imprinting themselves on the thin walls. I killed the engine. Silence slammed into me, thick and muffled by the storm. For a second, sitting there, in the cab, I almost convinced myself to just recline the seat and sleep in the truck. Then the wind hit the side of the rig in one sharp blast that made it rock, and I realized staying here meant listening to that all night, wondering if a skid from the road would come slicing across the lot. The office smelled like cheap coffee and older carpet. A bell sat on the counter, but I didn't have to hit it. The person behind the desk was already watching me when I walked in. You know when you see someone and immediately feel like they've been expecting you but not in a friendly way. That's how it was. Their eyes flicked over my jacket, the company logo, the snow crusted on my shoulders, then settled on my face like they were checking something off an invisible list. "Rough out there," they said, voice flat but not unkind. "You alone?" "Yeah," I answered, suddenly aware of how empty the place was behind me. They slid a paper registration card across the counter. Old-fashioned, name, plate number, room rate, all handwritten. I signed with a hand that didn't feel fully attached to my arm. They gave me a key on a heavy plastic fob, not a card. Old brass. The room number stamped into the fob looked worn down from years of fingers. "End of the row," they said. "You can park right in front of the door. Heat's on, but it'll take a bit to feel like it." As I turned away, they added, almost casually, "If you hear any knocks from the next room, ignore them. That side's empty." I paused. "You got thin walls?" They looked at me a second too long. "Just don't answer," they said. "Whatever you hear." There are 100 normal explanations for a warning like that. Plumbing noise, vents. Maybe they'd had problems with someone trying to get into the wrong room, but the way they said it slid under my skin and stayed there. The room was exactly what you'd expect. Bed, tiny table, lamp with a crooked shade, a heater unit that kicked like it resented being woken. The curtains didn't quite meet in the middle, leaving a sliver where the outside light could press through. I locked the door, drew the bolt, slid the chain, then did something I almost never do in motels. I dragged the small table in front of the door, just enough to make some noise if anyone tried to push it open. The silence after I shut off the TV was thick. Outside, the wind howled in that high, teething way that makes you think of distant animals. The heater coughed, rattled, settled into a low hum. Pipes clicked now and then in the walls. Standard old building orchestra. I lay on the bed fully clothed, just intending to rest my eyes for a bit before showering. The clock on the bedside table said 1:42 a.m. The red numbers glowed too brightly in the dim room. I remember staring at them, blinking slower and slower, my thoughts turning syrupy. Somewhere between one blink and the next, I slid under. I don't know how long I was out before the first knock came. It wasn't loud. Not that panicked, urgent pounding you might hear in an emergency. It was a gentler rhythm. 3 soft raps. A pause. 3 more. Like someone testing whether you were awake. It came from the wall behind the headboard, the side where, according to the person at the desk, the empty room was. Half asleep, my brain tried to slot it into something harmless. Plumbing, heater, some mechanical rhythm. But the timing was too precise. 3. Pause. 3. Pause. Waiting. I rolled onto my back, heart starting to pick up. The room felt colder. The heater hummed on, but its little stream of warm air suddenly seemed useless, eaten by the draft seeping in from under the door and around the window frame. Someone got the wrong side, I muttered to myself, trying to clear the sand from my voice. I sat up, every motion feeling slow, syrup thick. The knocks came again. Same pattern. Like whatever was on the other side was getting patient. Not urgent. Not angry. Just unwilling to go away. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, planted my feet on the thin carpet, and checked the time. 3:09 a.m. That heavy, dead middle of the night when your body temperature drops and your mind starts playing shadow games. The warning from the front desk floated back up through my fog. If you hear any knocks from the next room, ignore them. That side's empty. Maybe they'd rented it since. Maybe they hadn't bothered to update me. But the way they'd said empty wouldn't leave me alone. I stood and crossed the room in slow, quiet steps, like I'd disturb something if I walked normally. I pressed my ear to the wall where the knock had come from. Silence. My own breathing, louder than it had any right to be, the faint hum of the heater. I hesitated, then did something I still don't fully understand. I knocked back. 3 soft taps, same rhythm. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then, right where my knuckles had been, there came an answering series of taps, not quite echoing mine, slightly off, like someone mimicking a pattern they didn't recognize. Then a voice, so close it might as well have been on my side of the wall, spoke in a low, hoarse whisper. Finally, it said, "You're awake this time." My whole body went cold. The voice didn't sound confused. It sounded relieved, like it had been through this before. With me. I stepped back. "Wrong room," I said quickly. The way you might say, "wrong number," on the phone. "You've got the wrong room." A soft, shaky chuckle threaded through the wall. "You always say that." There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't come with adrenaline, just a slow, grinding dread. That's what settled into my stomach then. I forced my voice steady. "Who are you?" Fingers brushed the other side of the wall. I could almost feel the texture of knuckles through the thin paint. The voice stayed low, confidential, like someone sharing gossip. "You don't remember?" it asked. "Must have been a bad stretch this time. I'm just next door. I always am. You never stay long." I started, then stopped, because saying, I've never been here before, felt suddenly less true than it should have. The detours, the storms, the way the motel had seemed to appear closer than it should that night. How many winters had I been running similar routes? How many blank, exhausted nights had blurred into each other? Try the window, the voice said gently. You always like that part. You argue with it. It's kind of funny. Argue with what? I whispered. The view. The heater sputtered, coughed, fell briefly silent, then resumed. I crossed to the thin curtain slowly, fingers gripping the fabric. Every nerve in me wanted to stop, to sit back on the bed and ride out the night. But the heavier part, the part that needed to prove this was just some weirdo in the next room, pulled the curtains apart. The parking lot stared back at me. My truck sat hunched under a thin crust of new snow, its windshield a milky smear. The north wind sign flickered, casting a sickly pink glow over the half-buried sedan and the empty spaces. Beyond the lot, the highway carved a dark line through the white. Except, it wasn't right. The highway lights were wrong. On this stretch, they usually came at regular intervals. I'd driven it enough. But out there, where they should have been, were gaps. Long, unnatural strips of darkness where no poles stood. In those dead spaces, something else occupied the shoulder instead of snowbanks. Shapes, not buildings, not trees. More like doors, freestanding, evenly spaced, some half open, some shut. All facing the motel. I blinked hard, heart thudding against my ribs. When I opened my eyes again, the poles were back. Ordinary lights, ordinary ditches, just snow. See, the voice murmured through the wall. You always do that. You look and you make it normal again. I'm tired, I said, palms starting to sweat despite the cold. You're just messing with me. The front desk said your side was empty. A long, shuddering breath seeped through the plaster. That's one way of putting it. I turned away from the window, anger finally wrestling fear. If you're in the next room, I snapped, then why don't you open your door and come knock on mine like a normal person? The reply came slower this time. Because I can't open it from this side. There was something in the way they said this side that pressed on a very old, very animal part of my brain. Then how are you? I began. You always ask, the voice said. You always get tired. You always stop when it gets bad. And you always end up here when the storm thinks you won't make it to where you were going. That repetition, always, tightened my chest, like my life had started looping somewhere without my permission. You're talking like this has happened more than once, I said. Silence, then softly. How many winters have you driven that route? I thought about it. Really thought. Counted backward through years of routes, shifts, contracts. The exact number wouldn't come. Just a smear of white roads and late nights and motel beds that all felt interchangeable. You think this highway only runs one way, the voice continued. Out and back. But some nights, when the weather's right and you're tired enough, it folds. And places like this, a light tap on the wall for emphasis. We're what's left in the crease. Something moved outside. Just a shift in the air pressure, a faint rattle of the window frame. Snow brushing the door. The heater hummed a little louder, as if it were trying to drown out the words. What do you want? I asked, the frustration in my voice wobbling. If this is some joke. It's not a joke, they said sharply, then softened. What I want is simple. I want someone to stay all the way through, not just stop, sleep, then shut the door on us when the plows catch up. Us, I repeated. Who's us? As if in answer, more faint sounds rose from the wall. Not words, just impressions. A sigh here, a stifled laugh there, a faint cough, the shifting creak of a bed spring. Layers and layers of nights piled on top of each other, all happening in the paper-thin space beyond my headboard. You really don't remember, the closest voice whispered. Maybe that's why you get to keep leaving. You don't bring enough of it with you. My mouth felt dry. Enough of what? The room, the road, the way it looks when the doors show up. My thoughts flicked back to the highway view, the freestanding shapes where light poles should be. Doors, my brain had called them, standing out there in the snow facing the motel. What happens if I stay? I asked before I could swallow the question. The answer came almost immediately, like they'd been waiting for it for years. Then you don't have to drive tired anymore, they said. You don't have to hurry back and forth pretending you're going somewhere new. You become local. The way they breathed that last word chilled me more than the draft under the door. There's always a room for the ones who stay, another voice added, farther along the wall. Always a door. You've seen them. I thought of the heavy brass key in my pocket, the worn number on the fob, how it had felt less like something given to me and more like something handed back. You're not trapped, the first voice said. Not yet. In the morning, if you want, you'll get up, put the key on the table, and drive away like you always do. But you'll be back. The road will bend. The weather will turn. You'll think, well, at least there's that little motel, last resort. They paused. Then very softly, in one of these nights, you won't make it past 3:09. I looked at the clock. 3:21 a.m. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it almost hurt. Time moves weird here, the voice said, almost kindly. You sleep in loops. You wake up in loops. You promise yourself this is the last time. Then next winter, you're here again. Same storm, same exit that feels closer than it should be. So what's different now? I asked. Why do you sound so sure this is this time? The answer came from deeper in the wall, layered with others, like a chorus of murmured agreement. Because you're listening all the way through, they said. You haven't turned the TV back on. You haven't buried your head under the pillow. You're standing here, hand on the wall, asking questions like someone who knows the last exit might have already passed. My fingers were inches from the wallpaper now. I could see tiny nicks and stains in the pattern. The ghosts of furniture that had once stood there. The faint outline of a headboard mark from some other bed layout. All those small physical traces that say, people have been here. People have pressed their palms here and not always left. If I leave, I said slowly, right now, get in the truck and go. Can I still find the highway? The silence that followed was not reassuring. You can always find a highway, the voice said at last. It's just not always the one you thought you were on. Something about that broke whatever thin thread had been keeping me rooted in place. The part of me that drove in blizzards, that did chest compressions in ER bays, that dealt with panicking people at the worst moment of their lives. That part shoved everything else aside. I'm not staying, I said, more to myself than to them. I'm not staying. A low, almost disappointed murmur rippled along the wall. No one argued. No one shouted. That somehow made it worse. Okay, the first voice whispered. Then do me one favor. I hesitated at the door, key already in hand. What? When you go back outside, they said, don't count the doors. Just get in your truck and look straight ahead. If you count them, one of them might count you back. The lock felt stiff under my fingers. The chain rattled softly as I unhooked it. My hand shook as I moved the table aside with my knee. Every part of the room felt like it was leaning toward me, just slightly. I opened the door. The storm had eased. Snow still drifted down, but softer now. The lot was quiet under its pale blanket. My truck waited, a solid, familiar shape. The North Wind sign buzzed and flickered, one letter fully out now, reading North Inn. The highway beyond was a dark stripe, lights steady, poles where they should be. I forced myself not to look anywhere else, not at the far edges of the lot, not toward the ditches. I walked straight to the cab, boots crunching softly, breath loud in my own ears. When I climbed in and shut the door, the cab felt like the safest place in the world. As I pulled out, tires slipping a little on the incline, I kept my eyes fixed on the break in the snowbank, where the drive met the road. I did not look left or right. I did not count anything standing there. It wasn't until I'd driven for 20 minutes, the motel long vanished behind me, that I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. 1:42 a.m., same time I'd first laid down on the bed. Even now, when I hit that stretch of highway in winter, I feel my hands tighten on the wheel. I tell myself I'll stop in the next actual town if things get bad. I tell myself I'll never ever use some no-name exit for a place whose sign flickers. And when I pass a worn-looking motel, lights dim, lot half-plowed, I don't turn my head to see its name. Because I'm scared it'll be North Wind. And I'm more scared it'll be something else entirely, but the key in my pocket will still fit the lock. If you felt even a little of that pull toward the wrong kind of shelter while listening to this, tell me what you think you'd do at 3:09 a.m. in a room like that. And if you're ready to see what waits on the next frozen road, stay close to Something Scray, because some doors don't need you to knock. They just wait for you to run out of other places to go. Ever pick up something old by a lake and wonder if it picked you up first? That's where this starts. With a notebook that felt too heavy for its pages, like it carried more than ink. Let me draw you into this one like we're sitting by that same frozen shore, wind off the water nipping at our collars, the kind of cold that seeps into your thoughts before your skin. I wasn't out there to dig up history or chase ghosts. I had a camera, a tripod, and a half-baked idea for local footage, old lake houses, forgotten piers, the sort of atmospheric clips that make videos feel timeless. The spot was a cluster of weathered cabins on the edge of an Ontario lake, the kind locals called historical but never visited. Snow crusted the roofs, ice locked the shoreline, and the air smelled like damp pine and something older, like wet stone that had never fully dried. I'd heard about it from a town bulletin board, some society meeting about preserving the structures. Nothing formal, just a faded flyer with a date and a vague all welcome. Perfect for unobtrusive filming. I showed up early, boots crunching fresh powder, camera slung over my shoulder. The main cabin loomed largest, sagging porch, windows boarded but not tight. A few smaller ones dotted the shore, half swallowed by drifts. No cars, no footprints, just the low moan of wind pushing across the ice, making it hum like a distant engine. The society folks trickled in later, 3 or 4, bundled, chatting about grants and bylaws. They didn't mind me filming from the edges, calling it good exposure. I kept quiet, framing shots, the way sunlight fractured through cracks in the boards. Shadows stretching like fingers over the snow. One older woman mentioned a ledger inside the main house, old guest logs, dates from when the place rented rooms. Might be worth a look for authenticity, she said. I nodded, thinking close-ups of yellowed paper would add texture. They left after an hour, promising to lock up. I lingered, drawn to the quiet. The wind picked up, rattling loose siding. I stepped onto the porch, boards groaning underfoot, and pushed the door. It gave with a sigh, hinges stiff but willing. Inside smelled of mildew and cold ash, furniture shrouded in sheets, dust thick enough to see my breath swirl through it. The ledger sat on a rough table by the window, spine cracked, cover warped from damp. I flipped it open carefully, pages sticking, handwriting faded but legible, names, dates, payments from decades back. Mundane. Perfect. That's when I noticed the back pages. Not blank. Covered in tight, erratic script, dates jumping forward and back, entries shorter, almost frantic. Storm came early. Lights out twice. Water shows faces. I filmed a few spreads, voiceover murmuring about forgotten voices of the lakeside. The camera's red light felt like a tiny heartbeat in the gloom. Something shifted outside. A branch snapped, maybe. I glanced up, saw nothing but swirling flakes against the glass. The lake beyond was a flat white mirror, reflecting nothing but sky. I closed the ledger, slipped it into my bag for closer shots later. Borrowed with permission, I told myself, and headed out. The door latched behind me with a finality that made me pause, listening to the echo fade into wind. back home, miles from the lake. I pulled the footage onto my laptop that night. Grainy interiors, dust motes dancing in weak light, my narration overlay smooth. But the ledger shots, off. The pages looked sharper than I remembered, shadows deeper. I scrubbed through frame by frame. At one point, between blinks of the camera's eye, the script on the page changed. A line that read, "Guests 4," now said, "Guests 5." I froze the clip, heart ticking faster. Lighting glitch, angle shift. Had to be. Sleep came uneasy. Dreams of water lapping black wood. Whispers under the surface. Morning brought a text from the society woman. "Enjoyed your setup. Anything interesting?" I replied vaguely, then opened the ledger again. The changed line was back to 4, but a new entry at the bottom, today's date. My handwriting, not quite mine, but close. Cameraman, filming. My stomach dropped. I checked the footage. Still 5, dual records, one for the book, one for the lens. You know that itch when something latches onto your routine? That's what followed. I tried ignoring it, delete the clips, shelve the ledger. But curiosity gnawed. I drove back to the lake house 2 days later, early fog blanketing everything. The door was ajar, as if waiting. Inside, the table empty. No ledger. But faint scratches on the wood where it had sat, like claws testing grip. On the lakeshore, ice groaned underfoot. I filmed anyway. Wide shots of the cabins, water's edge. My reflection in the frozen surface looked doubled, one face slightly off-center. The camera caught it too. Playback showed ripples under the ice that hadn't been there, faint shapes shifting like ink in water. I uploaded a test clip to a private drive, time-stamped everything. Proof, I thought. Something real. That night, the lake intruded. A low hum woke me, vibrating through the floorboards. Not wind. More like resonance, the kind you feel in your teeth. I grabbed the camera, hit record, propped it on the windowsill facing the dark. Audio only after a minute. Steady breathing, close, then words layered under static. Show what's coming. The footage next morning. My bedroom empty, but the mic picked up splashes. Wet slaps on wood. A page turning. And visuals. Lake water pooling on the floor, rising inch by inch, reflecting the ceiling as if from below. It drained before the clip ended, leaving wet streaks the camera didn't capture in light. Panic edged in. I scoured online forums, lake house history, whispers of drownings, a storm that swallowed boats, guests vanishing into fog, no ledger mentioned. But one grainy photo from the 70s. The main cabin, same table, same scratches. Foreground, the lake, unnaturally still, a notebook open on the snow by the water's edge. The hum returned nightly. Always near water, sink, shower, even humidifier mist. Voices now, fragmented. Next page. Film the rise. We surface when watched. I recorded obsessively, stitching clips into a rough doc. Views stayed at 0. Comments wouldn't post. Files corrupted if I tried sharing beyond my drive. One entry night, I dreamed submerged. Woke soaked, sheets heavy, ledger floating beside the bed. Open to a blank page, my pen nearby, cap off. Ink bled upward from the paper, forming letters. Predict the thaw. Lake weather feeds showed no change, solid ice. But the footage predicted frames of cracking surface, dark shapes breaching. I drove back, compelled. Shoreline fractured already, thin leads of black water weaving through. Cabins leaned, as if exhaling. Inside, ledger waited. Pages filled ahead, future dates, my notes interwoven. Filmed breach, faces clear. Society returns, too late. The final entry, tomorrow's date. Cameraman joins ledger. I filmed the lake then, live. Water boiled without heat. Ledger propped open on the ice. Ripples formed words, visible only through the lens. Dates matching the book. Faces flickered, pale, eyeless, mouths working silent pleas. Society arrived as predicted, staring at the impossible. I captured it all, their shock, my explanation swallowed by wind. Panic peaked. I smashed the camera into the ice, shards sinking. Ledger burned in the cabin stove, pages curling black. Drove away, tires slipping on melt. Home, silence, no hum, dry floors. But the drive held uncorrupted files, Final Cut, auto-rendered, uploaded overnight, viral before I woke. Millions watched, lake rising, faces surfacing, my voice narrating from beyond frame. History isn't written here, it's rewritten. Views climbed, comments flooded. What lake? Fake, but chilling. Saw my face. Mine too in the water now, final frame, eyes open under ice. The hum returned faint from speakers. Laptop screen fogged. Lake water seeped from ports. I unplugged, but battery held, playing loop. Next viewer logs. I sit here now, telling you this. Camera off, but mic hot. If your screen ripples, if you hear water under words, close it. Delete, but you won't. You're watching the entry write itself. The lake waits for footage. It predicts you. Felt the water rise with me. Tell Something Scray what face you saw in the ledger. Stay for the final door. Some predictions don't end when the lens shuts. You ever had a feeling you were lost in a place you knew perfectly well on paper? That's what this is about. A map that knew more about me than I did about the places it showed. Imagine we're at a table together, and I slide that map between us. Creased, stained at the edges, covered in tiny notes. If you look close enough, you'll see why I don't trust closed doors anymore. I used to work with maps for a living. Nothing glamorous, just municipal mapping, updating road changes, new subdivisions, infrastructure. The kind of invisible work that quietly decides what exists in an official sense and what doesn't. If it's not on a map, for most people, it might as well not be real. I liked that power quietly. The idea that I was drawing the edges of people's reality. One winter, the city outsourced a backlog of old records to our office. Hand-drawn plats, survey sketches, notes from decades ago. Most of it was faded, brittle, useless except for historical reference. My job was to digitize what still matched the current layout and mark the rest as obsolete. I thought that was all it would be. Paper, lines, screens. Safe, contained work. Then I opened a box that hadn't been labeled properly. No date, no department code. Just my city's name, and in smaller handwriting under it, a word I thought was a joke at first. Interiors. Inside was a folded yellowed sheet larger than the others. When I spread it out, the first thing I noticed was that it wasn't a street grid. It was a network of rectangles and corridors, rooms, hallways, stairwells. Like a floor plan, but not of a single building. It sprawled and branched like a spider web that someone had tried to flatten. Here and there, tiny notes were written in the margins. Door sealed. No access. Reassigned. Some rooms were shaded in pale blue, others in dull gray. A few circled in a shaky red pen. At the top, in careful block letters, was a title. Closed Access Inventory, Metro Region. I remember sitting back, frowning. It read like a catalog of shut-off spaces, basements, utility corridors, abandoned wings, things officially there but unofficially forgotten. I should have scanned it, logged it, and moved on, but one detail hooked me. In the lower right corner was a small compass rose, and beneath it, a note in that same small cramped handwriting, updates itself, do not reprint. Updates itself. Paper doesn't just change. I ran my fingers lightly over the surface. The ink felt slightly raised in places, like it had been layered. I checked for anything obvious. Eraser marks. Different pen types. It all looked consistent, like one document that had been written in one go. But the room labels ranged from older departmental names I recognized from ancient HR files to terms that had only been introduced in recent years. It was as if time had layered itself onto one sheet. You'd probably do the same thing I did next. I started looking for locations I knew: old hospital basements, the transit tunnels, the storage levels under City Hall. Here and there, I found them, and beside some of them, tiny notes: converted, retired, bricked, key only. Every once in a while, instead of a description, there was just one word in red: kept. I took a photo of the map on my phone, just in case it got logged and disappeared into the system. A stupid, quiet little act of theft. That was the first step off the edge of the normal map, even if I didn't know it yet. A week later, I noticed the first change. I had the photo open on my computer during a slow afternoon, comparing it to a zoomed-in scan I'd made for the archive. Something didn't line up. A corridor that ended in a blank wall in the scan had a small square room drawn at the end of it in the photo. I thought I'd missed it somehow, so I checked the physical sheet again. The room was there now. It hadn't been before. It was labeled in faint new ink: Stairwell C Annex sealed. I flipped between the scan and the original like a bad magic trick. Same layout, same creases. But the older digital version didn't have that annex, and the paper one did. The ink of the new room was less faded, less sunk into the fibers. It looked fresher. But the handwriting matched perfectly. My first theory was simple. I'd scanned it badly. Maybe a corner had stayed folded. I rescanned the whole thing at a higher resolution, carefully flattening every edge. On the new file, the annex appeared, in crisp detail, like it had always been there. That should have been the point where I walked over to my supervisor and said, "Hey, this document's behaving strangely." But how do you say that without sounding like you need a few days off? Instead, I did what anxious people do best. I decided to verify alone. Stairwell C, Annex, sealed. I knew a building with a stairwell C, an older office block downtown we'd partially vacated for newer locations. The lower floors still held departments we hadn't moved yet. The upper floors were mostly shuttered. The basement had a half-abandoned feel, the kind of place where lights flicker and nobody changes them until they fail completely. One evening, after everyone else had gone, I told myself I just needed to check something for a project. It wasn't a complete lie. Clipboard in hand, because a clipboard makes you look like you're supposed to be there, I took the elevator down to the basement and stepped into the stale, recycled air. The hum down there always felt deeper, thick, like the building's thoughts stayed closer to the ground. Stairwell C was at the end of a long, fluorescent-lit corridor, tucked behind a fire door with a heavy bar. I pushed it open and found the familiar concrete steps, steel handrail, chipped paint. A functional, ugly space. The signage showed B for basement, arrows up for floors beyond, no mention of an annex. But according to the map, there should have been something past the bottom landing. A short corridor. A small room. Sealed. I walked down, each footstep echoing slightly. The landing at the bottom had a storage cage on one side, full of old chairs and dusty equipment. The other wall was blank, just painted concrete. No door. No corridor. No annex. I almost laughed at myself, relief washing through me. Of course, just a drawing error. An old plan for something that never got built. I reached out and put my hand flat on that blank wall just to physically reassure myself it was solid. The cold that came through the concrete wasn't normal. It leaked into my bones like I'd put my palm against ice. For a second, my breath fogged in front of me. The air around that section of wall felt a degree or two cooler, and under my hand, very faintly, I felt a line, not a crack, not a flaw, a straight vertical line, like the seam around a door someone had painted over. You know that pulse of adrenaline when your brain finally lines up what you're sensing with a new, unwelcome possibility. That hit me hard. I traced the line down and up. It continued straight, then turned. A horizontal edge at about shoulder height, the shape of a rectangle, a door buried in paint and plaster. I stepped back, heart pounding. My rational mind clawed for footholds. Old fire exit, sealed during renovation. No big deal. Happens all the time. But the fingers of my other hand were already reaching for the map in my bag, flattening it against the stairwell wall, aligning its lines with my surroundings. The door on the map was exactly where my hidden edges were, to the inch. The label next to it was blunt. Annex, intake, kept. Intake, kept. 2 words that don't sit comfortably together. You and I both know that if I'd walked away right then, this story would be different. Maybe I would have told it at parties as a weird office quirk. Hey, did you know there's a sealed door in the basement? But something about seeing a thing on a map gives it legitimacy. Like the world is saying, yes, this exists. So when I saw that blank wall and knew a room was on the other side, a room the paper clearly still acknowledged, I couldn't leave it alone. Over the next week, more changes crept into the map. A small utility corridor under a library I sometimes ate lunch in sprouted a new branch labeled Maintenance Rest Niche, Retired. A storage unit beneath a mall grew an extra rectangle, Overflow, Unauthorized. Each time I compared the scanned file to the original had more, always more. Tiny additions in that same uncanny, consistent handwriting. No new pen strokes visible. It was as if the ink redistributed itself overnight. The part that really started to get under my skin was this. A few of the new additions lined up uncomfortably well with recent events. A laundry room, where someone had gone missing last year, now had a small shaded square next to it, unlabeled except for a red circle. A section of storm drain, where a teen had drowned decades ago, now showed a platform, closed, that hadn't been there before. It was like the map wasn't just tracking places, it was tracking incidents. The spots where people slipped out of regular life and into something less official. Then one morning, I unrolled it and saw something that made my blood run ice cold. Near the center of the sheet, among the web of corridors and rooms, there was a new rectangle. Very small, unshaded. No attached building name. Just a simple label. Workstation, interim, pending. Next to it, in even smaller letters, my floor number, my office wing. I sat very still. The coffee in my hand went lukewarm. That little room on the map hadn't existed yesterday. It was drawn right where my cubicle cluster would be in a vertical section. But there was no such room on any architectural plan I'd seen. I checked our office layout on the network. Nothing by that designation. Yet there it was. Workstation, interim, pending. It felt like the map was reaching up. Like all those closed-off, underground, forgotten spaces had started to sprout a feeler toward where I sat every day, tapping at keys, cataloging them, watching them. That afternoon, the building's power hiccuped. Just a blip. Everything flickered off and on again. Monitors rebooted. People cursed softly. Routine. But when my screen came back, the desktop background had reset to default. And in the corner of the monitor, over the plain blue, a small icon blinked into existence that I didn't recognize. It looked like a folded map. My cursor hovered over it. The name read, Interior, Layer Pending. I yanked my hand back like the mouse had burned me. I didn't open it. I couldn't. Something in me knew that whatever was inside wasn't just a file. It was an invitation, or a summons. So I did something I'm not proud of. I shut my computer down. I told my supervisor I had a stomach thing. I took the map, carefully rolled, and walked out into the cold like it was the only real thing I owned. That night, at home, I unrolled it again on my kitchen table. The edges curled up, stubborn from age. The apartment was quiet. The muffled sounds of other people's lives seeped through the walls. TVs, taps, a baby crying faintly. Normal, safe, separate. On the map, my workstation interim pending was shaded now, pale gray. A fine crosshatch pattern, just like the intake annex had been. Next to it, in that same red pen as the other kept labels, one new word had been added. Notified. I sat there a long time, looking at that word. Notified. Past tense. Not to notify. Done. Completed. As if some system behind the paper had ticked a box. Then I noticed something else, tiny, almost invisible, in the lower margin. A little legend I'd assumed was decorative at first, a cluster of symbols, a square with lines through it, a square half-filled, a blank one, a circle. Next to each, a term in that cramped hand. Open. Closed. Retired. Kept. Pending. Beside pending, a faint arrow curved, pointing back up toward the mess of rooms. For the first time since I'd found it, the urge to destroy the map hit me. Not just throw it away, actually tear it. Burn it. Erase those careful lines. But even as the thought came, another pressed against it. What if it doesn't want to be destroyed? What if that's not an option anymore? I folded it instead. Not the careful, archivist folds of the office. Sloppy, uneven creases. Jammed it into the back of a closet behind a stack of shoes and a vacuum, as if putting it in the dark would make it forget me. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that unfinished annex door, my palm pressed against the painted-over seam, the label kept, the word notified. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a faint sound, a dry, papery crackle, not loud, not near, but distinct enough in the night silence to snap my eyes open. It was coming from the closet. I lay there, staring at the door, utterly still. The sound went on softly, the slight rasp of paper being shifted, unfolded, refolded, as if someone were smoothing it out, straightening it, erasing my careless creases. I didn't get up. I couldn't. That's the truth. I lay there and listened to my own heart beating in my ears, and that almost gentle brushing, like fingertips skimming old roads. When the sound finally stopped, the apartment felt different. Not invaded. Not exactly. More like remeasured. The next morning, the map was gone from the closet. In its place, neatly stacked where I'd shoved it, was a small blank notebook, the cheap kind you get at dollar stores. On the inside cover, in that same cramped hand, was a single line. Local interior log, personal. Entries will be integrated. Under it, a date, that day's. The first page was waiting. Empty. Expectant. I didn't write in it. I shut it and put it in a drawer instead. But sometimes, when the apartment is very quiet, I get the sense that somewhere under my floor, behind my walls, beyond the regular lines of the building's plans, there are rooms rearranging themselves, making space, crosshatching more spaces gray, updating themselves. And I keep thinking about something that never made it onto any official map, but lives on this one. Those little red-circled rooms labeled kept, the annex behind the stairwell, the platforms under the drains, the spaces where people didn't just pass through but vanished into. We like to think maps are how we control where we're going, but sometimes they're more like status reports, a quiet way the world keeps track of what it's already claimed. So if you ever find yourself looking at a floor plan or scrolling through some hidden layer of your city on a website, and you see a room you don't recognize, a room labeled something like retired or intake or pending, don't go looking for it just because you can. Don't let curiosity turn you into a new little gray rectangle on some sheet you'll never see. And if, one day, a map you didn't ask for shows you that it has a place reserved with your routines written in tiny perfect handwriting, ask yourself a hard question. Are you the one reading the map, or is it just quietly, patiently reading you? If you felt that tightening in your chest while I laid this out, tell me what kind of hidden space you think your own building might be hiding. And if you want to see what happens when someone actually writes in that personal log, stay close to Something Scray, because some maps don't just show you where you are. They mark where you're meant to end up. What if all the roads we've traveled so far weren't leading somewhere new, but back to the same locked gate? Lean in close, because this isn't just another tale. It's the one where you and I turned the final key together. You've been with me through the frost-bound house, the silent toll booth, echoing cabins, whispering orchards, stalled elevators, shifting maps, storm-trapped motels, and that cursed ledger by the lake. Each one left a mark, a chill on the skin, a whisper in the ear, a shadow that lingers when you blink. Feel them piling up now. That's no accident. They're threads, pulling tight around one frozen road at the edge of everything, where Ontario's winter doesn't end but folds into itself. I'm taking you there, step by step, because if we're honest, you've already started walking it with me. It began as a pull I couldn't name. After the lake house footage went viral, those impossible ripples, faces under ice that commenters swore were theirs, I stopped sleeping right. Not nightmares exactly, more like half-memories, glimpses of that first depot's breathing ice. The toll booth's ghostly reflection staring back with my eyes, orchard sap trickling dates into my palm. I'd wake with the taste of lake water in my mouth, fingers tracing invisible lines on my nightstand like a map no longer needed. The world outside my window looked wrong, roads curving sharper, signs flickering like the Northwind neon. Dispatch calls came less often. Friends texted about taking a break. But I knew better. The stories weren't over. They were converging. One dawn, gray light bleeding through curtains, I found it. A key. Not in a drawer or pocket, but on the floor by my bed, brass heavy. No fob, just a worn number etched deep, 9. The digit pulsed faintly under my thumb, warm against winter chill. No chain, no tag. Like it'd been dropped there while I slept, waiting for me to notice. I pocketed it without thinking, the way you pocket a ticket stub from a show you half remember. That day, my truck wouldn't start. Battery dead, no explanation. Walking to the corner store, every side road looked the same, endless white stretches flanked by pines that leaned inward, branches knitting overhead like a tunnel. You feel it too, don't you? That tightening in your chest, like the air's getting thinner. Good. Hold on to it. By evening, I was driving. Not my rig. A borrowed beater from a neighbor who swore he'd left it for you. The odometer spun backward at first, then froze. Radio static resolved into layered voices. Not mine. But familiar. The toll booth murmur, orchard rustles, elevator breaths. The gate, they chorus softly. Where it locks. The highway ahead blurred. Exits vanishing until one appeared unbidden. A narrow lane marked service only, no outlet. I took it because my hands turned the wheel. Snow deepened fast, tires churning slush that hissed like warnings. The road narrowed to single lanes, pines crowding close, their trunks scarred with familiar scratches, toll booth marks, orchard dates, map lines. Windshield wipers slapped rhythmically, 3 taps, pause 3, echoing the motel knocks. Headlights caught glimpses, a frozen handprint melting upward on a tree. Elevator doors ajar in the ditch revealing yellowed walls, ledger pages fluttering from branches like trapped birds. My breath fogged the glass, forming shapes. Faces from the lake, reflections from the booth. I wiped them clear, but they reformed, mouthing silent pleas. Open it. Hours passed, or minutes, time smeared like the wipers. The lane ended at a chain-link gate, rusted but sturdy, topped with barbed coils, frosted white. Beyond, a single cabin, lights glowing faint orange through east windows, smoke curling lazy from the chimney. No other structures, no road continuing. Just that gate, padlock gleaming new silver, waiting. I killed the engine. Silence crashed in, broken only by distant ice cracking on an unseen lake. The key burned hot in my pocket. 9. This was 9. Stepping out, boots sank ankle-deep in powder that felt resistant, like walking on packed memory. Wind-carried scents layered thick. Depot mildew, booth coffee, cabin dust, orchard sap, elevator antiseptic, map ink, motel carpet, lake damp. The gate rattled softly as if breathing. Up close, lynx bore etchings. Tiny ledgers of names not mine but feeling personal, dates aligning with each story's pivot. My hand found the lock unbidden. The key fit perfectly, brass kissing steel with a click that echoed too long. The gate swung inward on silent hinges. Footprints. No. Bootprints matching mine exactly, led straight to the cabin door. I followed, each step sinking with a faint echo behind me, like a shadow learning pace. Porch creaked underfoot, boards etched with toll booth scratches. Door handle turned easy, warm brass again. Inside, one room, fire crackling merry in a stone hearth, table set for. How many? Chairs circled it, shadows shifting in seats. No faces yet, just impressions. Postures from each tale. Slouched toll worker, tense orchard pruner, rigid elevator rider. Sit, the room seemed to say, voices blending from walls, floor, flames. Not commanding, inviting, like old friends after a long drive. I did, drawn to the head chair. Table held artifacts. A shard of breathing ice from the depot, badge melting my name from the booth, recorder tape from the cabin, sap drip twig from the orchard, elevator button marked L, folded map corner showing my workstation gray, motel keychain flickering open-closed, lake ledger page rippling wet. Each hummed recognition as my fingers brushed them. You gathered us, the chorus murmured, flames leaping higher, thread by thread. Shadows solidified, not monsters, but echoes. My reflection from the booth, younger. Orchard self with sap on neck. Elevator me pressing door close, map tracer with ink-stained hands. Multiples, overlapping. Each a pivot where I'd almost stayed. The gate opens when you accept the roads weren't separate. I gripped the table edge, wood warm, pulsing like flesh. This is the end, I whispered. Or meant to. Voice came layered, mine atop theirs. Outside, wind howled gate-rattling fury, but here cozy trap snapped shut. Door. Vanished into seamless wall. Windows. Mirrored black, reflecting endless roads converging. What now? Now you choose, the booth echo said, eyes calm wrong. Drive on alone, gate relocks, stories fade, but pull returns. Orchard me nodded, sap trickling fresh. Or stay, localize, no more loops. Faces circled closer, lake ripples forming grins, motel whispers chuckling, elevator patients shuffling from shadows. Their hands extended, palms up, depot print throbbing, map lines crawling toward me. Firelight danced, casting 9 shadows on walls, each reaching to merge with mine. The air thickened, sweet with wood smoke and rot, pulling me down like thaw mud. You feel the choice too, right? Sitting there with me, key in hand, gate swinging. Part of you wants out, back to safe roads, forgetting whispers. But deeper, the pull, belonging to the weave, no more solitary drives. My hand lifted toward theirs. A crack split the air, not thunder, but gate straining outside, chain groaning. Snow howled in. Echoes flinched, shadows wavering. Not yet, cabin voice hissed. Listeners here. They turned, not to me, but you. Faces wheeled, eyes locking through the fourth wall, reflections multiplying in their pupils. Your room, your screen, your face now etched in ice shards. Panic surged. I lunged up, chair toppling. Artifacts rattled, spilling. Badge pooling liquid metal spelling your handle. Ledger page inking your name next. Gate burst inward, blizzard roaring entry. Echoes shrieked, dissolving into flurries. Booth driver melting snowman-esque. Orchard trees snapping brittle. I bolted through, key clutched, gate slamming behind on shrieks cut short. Outside, endless road again, truck idling phantom-like. Dawn bled pink. Odometer reset. But rear view showed cabin intact, door ajar. 9 shadows waving you in. I've driven since. Normal routes, story silenced. Key stays, pocketed. Warm reminder. Gate waits, relocked but thin. One tired night, wrong weather. You're the listener they meant. They saw you through me, Threads pulling your way now. Next storm, check your dash. Feel that itch? Keel appear. Gates yours. If the wind picked up while we sat here, or shadows lengthened your way, comment the face you glimpsed in the mirror. You've unlocked Something Scray's final door. Subscribe, because the roads circle back, and you're driving them now.